Now it started. Okay, so we are Pirkei Mishnah Daled, the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos, the 4th Mishnah. This is a good one after having had a bit of a break. They're all good ones, I know. But this is a good one after having a break. So the Mishnah says as follows. It says, remember that this is the chapter that goes through numbers. So 10 of these things, and later we'll see 7 of those things, and after that 4 of the other things. So we're still in the 10 sequences, and it says as follows. You ready? Tell me if you pick up anything unusual about how this is being said. Asara nisim nasu lavoseinu b'Mitzrayim. 10 miracles were done for our forefathers in Mitzrayim. Ve'asara al hayam, and 10 miracles were done for them at the sea, which obviously refers to the splitting of the sea. Then the Mishnah continues. Eser makois hevi HaKadosh Baruch Hu ala Mitzrayim b'Mitzrayim, that Hashem brought 10 plagues against the Egyptians in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. Ve'eser al hayam, and 10 at the sea. Isn't it nice that we're learning this Mishnah when we're reading the parashas? It really works, right? So far so good. Are you happy with that?
No,
you happy with that?
40.
What's that?
It makes 40.
Well, you're saying it makes 40 altogether. So 20 sets of miracles, 20 sets of plagues. Okay. Any other issues with that? No? Okay, good. Everybody's happy? Great. Then the Mishnah continues and it says, Asara nisyonos nisasu aviseinu b'midbar. Our forefathers tested Hashem with 10 different tests while they were in the desert. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, Vayinasu oisi ze eser pe'amim. Hashem says, you tested me these 10 times, v'lo yishamu b'koili, and you didn't listen to my voice. So if we had to break it down, we can say the Mishnah actually has 3 parts. One part is about the miracles Hashem did for us both in Mitzrayim and at the splitting of the sea. The other is the plagues that he did against the Egyptians in both of those scenarios. And then the third segment is the way we misbehaved afterwards. That we tested Hashem 10 times. And everybody's still happy with this Mishnah, yes? I'm just checking. Just want to make sure that you're happy, yeah? You're happy with this Mishnah? You're happy? Okay. So if that's the case, let me ask you a simple question. Can anybody list even one of the 10 miracles that Hashem did for the Jews in Egypt?
They were the same as the plague.
No. Is that not a question? What do we mean? 10 miracles were performed for the Jewish people in Egypt, and then you tell us there were 10 plagues for the Egyptians. Are those not the same things?
No, the plagues are what's done to the Egyptians. The fact that they haven't
Okay, fine. So let's just explore that for a second. Let's explore that. So we have what on earth happened there? So we have a plague called blood, yes? Yes, we have a plague of blood. Okay, what's the miracle?
So it turned blood for the Egyptians, not for us.
So, okay, so I just want to understand. So the fact that the water becomes blood is a plague, obviously. The fact that our water does not become blood is a miracle. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't know, because they say the default that it's going to be blood, and if that's the case, then it's a miracle. And if it's not the default, then it's just we have default blood.
Exactly. In other words, what's the default state of the liquid? Water. So you don't have to do a miracle to keep the water as water. All you have to do is direct the plague to that water source and not to this water source. So is that necessarily a miracle for us?
Yes.
What's the miracle? He just saved us from a plague. He just didn't infect our water. That doesn't turn it into a miracle. So where are the 10 miracles that happened to the Jewish people in Egypt? Let's use another example, okay? Choose another example. Let's choose another example. So there was lice. Yes, there was a plague of lice.
That was a real miracle that didn't catch.
That it didn't go from right? The fact anybody who's ever had a child in school knows what a miracle it is that lice didn't go from the Egyptians to the Jews, right? Okay. Except for the fact that we know the Jews lived in a different area. They lived in a different region. And we also know that at this point in time, all the slave labor was halted. So it's not like they were coming in to work together with the other Egyptians. They were living in Goshen. Not such a big miracle, it would seem, that they didn't have lice. No? Any others?
Well, with the hail and
same thing. They live in different regions.
No, we need the angel of death.
The angel of death?
Do something to prevent.
Fine. Okay. So we found one. The Mishnah says that there were 10 miracles and we found one.
Could it also not be entirely there's something totally separate, like they still kept the Yiddish cut, even though
Okay.
it was easier to assimilate.
So the fact that the Jews retained their Jewish identity, is that a miracle or is that an achievement?
No, it's an achievement.
That's an achievement, right? Okay.
We had Shisha B'Keres Echad. We had like a lot of things that were done.
Okay, fine. So you're saying the fact that they had so many children all at one time, which that was miraculous? Okay, there we go. So perhaps if we scrounge around, we'll get a few miracles and possibly we'll be able, hopefully they'll come to 10.
It's all the way you look at things.
Then
The same miracle, or the same play.
Right. Okay, good. So we're going to hold that thought. That's a really good point. It's all a matter of how you look at it. So it is possible to look at something that is happening as a plague for the Egyptians and see within it a miracle for the Jewish people. We'll have to explore that. Okay, good point. Next point. What were the 10 miracles at the sea? Or for that matter, what were the 10 plagues that happened to the Egyptians at the sea?
But isn't that the inverse of I think the miracles that happened to us were the opposite for the...
Okay, so what were they?
So the water split, then the water...
The water split. Okay, so there we go. This is actually going to be easier. So the water split for us. The water caved in on them. Okay, so let's make a list of 10. Can we do 10? It's much easier to identify 10 things that happened in Egypt. What are the 10 things that happened at Kriyas Yamsuf? Anybody want to attempt this?
Food on the side or something.
Okay, good. So there's one. 12. 12 channels is one of the miracles. The fact, by the way, none of the Meforshim, even though it's brought in the Midrash, none of the Meforshim bring the fact that there was food as they were walking through the sea. But they do bring the fact that they could touch the wall and it would become fresh drinking water, that was a miracle. And then they add a second miracle that as soon as they stopped, it would revert to being the solid wall between the 12 channels. Okay, so splitting the sea, 12 channels, drinking water, the water turns back into the walls. That's 4 out of 10. Right, the floor. Now here's an interesting one, right? Because there are 3 miracles in that. The one is that the seabed became dry land for us, because that's not natural. If anybody's been to the beach, you see that as the water recedes, it's very, very muddy. So you can imagine what it's like under the sea. So the fact that it became solid ground for us, then it became clay for the Egyptians. So the Midrash tells us they got stuck in the clay. And there was another miracle, which is that after it became clay, it actually became incredibly uneven, so that it kept tripping and falling and they couldn't get out. Okay, so what are we up to now? About 7, yes? What else have we got? Any other miracles? Yes. The fact that it became a canopy. Everybody always thinks that the sea split open. It was like a convertible car. But it actually became a canopy over the Jewish people, over the 12 channels as they walked through. And so that's the clay. That's the whole thing of the clay, is that it became like this hot clay that burnt off the hooves of their horses. What else happened? So the others are that it crashed down. The water crashed down on the Egyptians while it was still solid. So it wasn't that they were drowned, as it was that literally they had chunks of this crystallized water falling down on top of them. And the other one is that the Jews could see each other through the different channels, that it was a completely transparent barrier between the different channels, so nobody felt that they were alone or perhaps going in a direction that was away from everybody else. Okay, so those are the different miracles. Great, that's in a sense, if I dare say, a little bit more for interest's sake, rather than for exploration of this Mishnah. Now, you know what's really difficult to understand about this Mishnah is, what's the order of events? Surely the order of events should have read like this. There were 10 miracles in Egypt and 10 plagues for the Egyptians. There were 10 miracles at the sea and 10 plagues at the sea. It's interesting that the Tana of the Mishnah should group them, that first it tells us all the good things that happened to the Jews, even though that's not technically chronological, and then tell us all the bad things that happened to the Egyptians, again, not chronological. So we've got to understand, why would the Tana do that? In order to understand any of this, there are 3 key questions we have to ask. Number 1, what is a miracle? I know, everybody will say, but we know what a miracle is. Okay? So number 1, we have to understand, what is a miracle? Number two, we have to understand what does it mean to test Hashem, because that's clearly part of this conversation, and it must be a big part of the conversation. And number three, what is the relevance of the number 10 to this whole picture? So let's start with the number 10. What have we already learned? Remember, we're now on Mishnah number 4. So what have we already learned in a previous Mishnah, in this chapter, about the number 10 that may have something to do with this? Okay, that's like really broad as a question. So let's go back. What have we already learned about the number 10? We said that the world was created with 10 utterances. That means to say that the fabric of creation works on a system of tens. That's going to be relevant for our conversation. What else have we already learned in the preceding Mishnahs about the number 10?
10 things were made.
Not there yet. We haven't got there yet. That's one of the most fascinating Mishnahs, but we're not there yet. Okay, so what else have we learned about the number 10? We have learned that there were 10 generations from Adam until Noach, but more relevant for our conversation, 10 generations from Noach until Abraham, so that Abraham could come along and take all of their schus, all of their merits. And then what did Hashem do to Avraham Avinu? What did he do? He tested him. How many times? 10 times. So, most of the commentators of the Mishnah tell us that the fact that Avraham Avinu, and again, it's always important to remind ourselves that there are very few people in our history who are called our parents. And that's always relevant because a parent has the capacity to bequeath us things or to pass things on. What do they call it in today's world? Epigenetics. Things that get passed on subconsciously from one generation to the next generation. Because Avraham Avinu withstood 10 tests that Hashem gave him, therefore the Jewish people merited 10 miracles in Egypt. That would be the link. Okay? So in other words, we're riding on Avraham Avinu's coattails. He did 10 magnificent things for Hashem, therefore Hashem did 10 magnificent things for his descendants. Okay? But there's a problem with that. You know what the problem is? Look what the Jews do after that. They test Hashem 10 times. So you see the complete circle here? Hashem tests Avraham. He passes the tests. Therefore, he gets the merit of having the 10 miracles for his children. The children get the 10 miracles, and what does it do for them? Well, we all know what happens when you spoil your children, right? They test you. So it sounds like it wasn't really, in the long term, it doesn't sound like it was a very successful operation. That's what it would appear. So let's try and understand what's going on over here. In order to understand this, let's look at another possibility, which we've already mentioned, which is that 10 is the number of creation. In other words, if you want to take somebody through a spiritual process in its fullest extent, that spiritual process must have 10 steps. So you want to take Avraham and you want to turn him into the spiritual superhero. He's got to go through not just one test, not just a dozen, but dafka 10 tests, because 10 will be this process of taking somebody right through everything of their neshama. In the same way, if you want to dismantle an evil empire like Egypt, you need 10 miracles, because you need to break it apart at all the 10 aspects of what make it exist, because everything is created with 10 forces, with 10 powers. So actually what we're discussing over here is the dismantling of Egypt and then the response of the Jewish people. And this is where things start to get a lot more interesting. Let's take the word in Hebrew for miracle, which is the word nes. And what's a synonym? What other words could we potentially use for miracles? Which is what? Pele or niflaois, if we're using the plural, right? What is the connotation of the word nes? What is a nes all about? That's one thing we're going to have to explore over here, because if you really read what's going on in the Mishnah, look at this. Asara nisim. There were 10 miracles that Hashem did for the Jewish people in Egypt. Fast forward to the end of the Mishnah. What does it say? What's the word that we use for testing Hashem? Nisayon, right? So those are really similar words. A nes, a miracle, and a nisayon, a test. They're very similar words. We've got to understand what is the correlation and connection between the two of them. One of the commentaries on the Mishnah called the Yochin says that the difference between a chet and a nisayon is as follows. Why do people sin? Usually because of temptation. So that I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I can't help myself. That's usually what drives a chet. Or an aveira. Right? An aveira is a matter of a person being tempted, being drawn to behavior that is against what Hashem wants. What is a test? In other words, let's put it this way. When a person says, I know I shouldn't be telling you this, but. Have you ever heard that line? The person says, I know I shouldn't be telling, I know it's Lashon Hara, but. Is that a test or a sin?
It's a
I
sin.
think you're describing sin.
Nobody's testing Hashem saying, okay, I'm going to test Hashem now until this Lashon Hara. That's not how it works, right? So the nature of a chet or an avera is that a person is tempted to do something that they know they're not supposed to do. The nature of a nisayon, of a test, is where a person is going through what we would call in the modern world a crisis of faith. It doesn't necessarily translate into an action. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. But it's an internal process. It's a crisis of faith. So there are 10 times in the history of the Jews in the desert where they had crises of faith. Do we know what the 10 are?
Well, water, the food.
Okay, I'm really surprised that food wasn't first. Because if you know Jewish people, you know the first thing is always going to be around food. So what are they? Let's go try and create some kind of a list. Okay, so we've got the water. When did they complain about water? By Morah, right? Where they complained after the great miracle of the splitting of the sea. They complained that there was no water. Then they complained that the water was bitter. So that's one of the times they test Hashem. We're not necessarily going to go chronologically. Where else? You said food, right? So where did they test Hashem with food? How many times did the Jews test Hashem with food? Out of a list of 10 times that they tested Hashem across 40 years in the desert, how many of them had to do with food? 4. Twice with the slav is mentioned in 2 different parts of the Torah, and twice with the man. The one time they tested Hashem with the man is they kept food for tomorrow, which they were told explicitly not to, and the other time is when they went out on Shabbos morning to find food, which they were told explicitly not to. 4 times with food and 1 time with water. That means that human consumption takes up 50% of all the times that the Jews tested God in the desert, and nothing's really changed. Okay, what are the others?
Of course, the golden calf.
The golden calf, obviously. They tested Hashem with the golden calf. What's that? The miraglim, obviously, the spies.
When Aaron the snakes.
Korach doesn't feature. Isn't that interesting? Korach does not feature as one of the times they tested Hashem, because it was a small band of people as opposed to everybody else. Yes, it's called Taveira, which is basically the whole story with the snakes and the whole, okay, right? Okay, that leaves 2 others. What are we missing? Refidim, which is just before Amalek, where they kind of lost interest in their commitment to their Judaism, or they lapsed, I should say, in their Judaism.
When they went to war.
No. The other one is before the splitting of the sea, where they said, are there no graves in Egypt that you took us to die in the desert? So what do you see? What's common to all of these things? They didn't actually do something. Right? They just despaired, except for the golden calf. The golden calf, obviously they did something. It was the result of despair, the fact that they figured Moshe's not coming back, and therefore they overreacted. But the reality is, in most of these scenarios, it's not that they proactively went and they did something. So what's a test? And nisayon, according to the Yochin, is where a person lapses in their faith, as opposed to where a person acts based on a temptation. Okay? Interesting. Now what's a miracle? This is where the most fun of this Mishnah comes from. What is a miracle? Everybody's going to say a miracle is something which is unnatural, beyond the natural. So let's ask ourselves the question. If we theoretically could do this, if we could import somebody from the 18th century into our world, how many of the things that we take for granted would they consider miraculous? Pretty much all of it. I mean, here we are complaining every single time we don't have power, and they're like, what is that? Right? As I saw somebody describe it really well. There's a reason it was called the Dark Ages. Right? They lived with permanent power outages for like thousands of years. So what constitutes a miracle? Is a miracle just something that surprises us? I'll give you an example. It's quite common for people to say that childbirth is a miracle. But it's actually natural.
No, but
It is awe-inspiring.
Nace means height, so something that's held with some sort
There
of
we go. Exactly.
speed.
Exactly. So what is nace? The direct translation of the word nace is not a miracle. The real translation of the word nace is the mast of a ship is the nace. Or as the Pasuk says, kinosoi nace horim, like the flagstaff that sits on top of the mountain as the symbol of the greatness of a country. You know, you put your flag where everybody can see it, high up on the mountain. So nace always represents something that is elevated, and that is an indication of what a miracle is, where reality is elevated to another plane that doesn't behave according to the laws of nature. Okay? Now, what does that mean? You know what the problem is with a miracle? There's a big problem with miracles. And nobody ever talks about it. What do you say? There are not enough of them. I was going to say there's not enough of them. So, you know, to get used to a miracle, you have to have a lot of miracles to get used to a miracle. You know what the real problem is with miracles? They shouldn't be allowed to happen. Why not?
It takes away your free will.
Okay, so you're saying the problem is the recipient. You're saying the problem is the recipient doesn't have enough faith in Hashem, so they need the spectacular fireworks in order to get them on board. That's why miracles shouldn't happen, which is valid. And I actually agree with that. In fact, two different opinions on this Mishnah. I don't remember who one of them. One is definitely the Sfas Emes says the message of this Mishnah is, look what miracles produce. 10 miracles in Egypt, 10 miracles at the sea. What's the result? A whole lot of people who complain. In other words, that philosophy that people use, which basically says, if God ... then I ... never works. It's the old joke of the guy with the parking space. And if you don't know that joke, you haven't been listening to your rabbi, because it's been used at least 15 times in your shul. Right? So yes, that's one, but there's a much deeper ideological problem with a miracle.
I think it's the inverse thing again, where miracles make all the mundane seem pathetic. So if you were to see every day the sunrise, and that's all that ever happened, then that would be amazing. But now we see other things that are so great, and sometimes that's great, not so exciting.
So effectively that argues that the difference between a miracle and the ordinary is frequency.
Yeah, not only frequency, it's something that's out of the ordinary. So what happens is, like you said, it's a nace, it's a height, right? So now all of a sudden the whole panorama seems very flat.
Right, exactly. Because you've now seen something spectacular, everything else is kind of boring. Okay? I'm looking for a deeper ideological problem with miracles. Why does it take away your free will? Is this not what this mission is showing us? They have the miracles and they still have the free will. Look how they behave. Isn't that what it's showing us? There's a serious ideological problem with miracles. And we don't ever stop to think about it because we're all waiting for miracles, praying for miracles, happy when miracles happen. But there's a very powerful ideological problem with miracles. Namely, in order for a miracle to happen, something natural has to be overridden. Does that make sense? So for example, if you have doctors who can prove medically that a person in their current health circumstances has no outcome that is positive, and then they not only recover, but they're better than they were before, that means that's what we call a miracle. That means that what was designated to happen naturally has now been overridden by a miracle. Okay, let's use a much starker miracle. Splitting the sea. It's in our Mishnah. It's one of the examples. splitting the sea, hail that's got fire in it, water that becomes blood. Every one of those miracles interferes with the natural process. Why is that ideologically problematic? Because it's the first line of the Torah. Right. The first, Bereshis bara Elokim. God created the natural reality. If nature was a human construct, then it would make sense that Hashem would feel the need, so to speak, to interfere with the human way of doing things and do it His way. But seeing as nature is God's construct, Hashem decided that there would be a thing called illness, God forbid. And Hashem decided that people would pass away, or would have financial crises, or would land up being killed by their enemies. Yes, wonderful. The Jews escaped the Egyptians. They did not escape the Spanish, the Crusaders, the Cossacks, the Nazis. It's part of how Hashem created the world. If that's the case, there's an ideological problem when a miracle happens. Why is Hashem, so to speak, interfering with His own system? Which must be a valid system, must be an MS system, must be a true system. As much as we love miracles, we embrace miracles, we want miracles, we daven for miracles, if we're objective about it, they don't make sense. I don't mean they don't make sense because things happen that nobody can explain. It doesn't make sense that there should be a miracle.
You mean that God created the ability for miracles?
Correct. It's almost like, what, did He change His mind? Was He dissatisfied?
So the truth is, when Hashem created Bereshis in the beginning, everything should have been as it was supposed to be. Having a miracle now takes away that power of that Bereshis. Correct. Exactly that. If Hashem created the world in this particular way, that should be the best way it should be. The fact that there's now a miracle sounds like an interference and a correction, which implies that that wasn't the way that it should be.
But if you're saying the miracles are connected to Avram's behavior, then superhuman behavior should...
That makes it worse.
Power.
That makes it worse, right? Because now effectively what we're saying as Jewish people is, if we, humans, who give ourselves way too much credit already, if we do something, that will be powerful enough to override the way that Hashem Himself designed the world.
That's how Hashem designed the world, and if we are good enough...
Now, let's analyze that answer, because that's our default go-to answer. That's the plan. That's what Hashem did. That's how He made it, right? He wants us to be relevant, which is valid, which is true, and it's all fine and good because it makes us feel better, but now we've got to understand it ideologically.
Sorry, is that mean childbirth isn't a miracle?
Technically, Hashem designed the natural order that people, lahavdil animals, have children. It is miraculous. Yes? It feels miraculous. It is awe-inspiring. It is not technically a miracle. It is technically the brilliant... Yes, if a person can't have children and then they have a child, that's a miracle. But no matter how blown away we are by seeing a child and wondering how did that happen, just because we're impressed doesn't mean it qualifies as a miracle. Okay? That's important to know. Now we need a template of miracles to understand how miracles work, where they come from, what they do, and so on and so forth. Here's our template. This story, because generally speaking, whatever stories are recorded in the Torah are there not just because they're important parts of early history, but because they are templates for the whole of how Judaism sees life. So these stories that happened at the dawn of the Jewish people, these are the stories that are going to define for us how miracle is in the world of Jews. So now, you ready for this? You ready? Hang on. Fasten your seatbelt, as they say. We'll start with something everybody knows. Which name of Hashem is the name associated with the natural process? Which name of Hashem is associated with the natural process? Elokim. Right? How do we know that? Bereshis bara Elokim. The creation of the natural process comes from the name Elohim. Every name of Hashem represents a particular type of energy that he inputs into existence. The name Elohim represents the energy that creates natural processes. If it's helpful, take the name Elohim, obviously with a hey, not with a kuf like we pronounce it, and it has the same gematria value as the word hateva, which is nature. So that helps. Which is the name of Hashem that we'd associate with miracles? Which is Hashem, yes, exactly. Which is what? Yud Kei Vav Kei. How do we know? Because we read the parasha of Shabbos. And Hashem says to Moshe at the beginning of the parasha, he says, V'eira el Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov, I appear to Avram Yitzchak Yaakov bekel shakai, with only the extent of my revelation to the point of what's represented by the names kel shakai, u'shmi Hashem, which is Yud Kei Vav Kei, that name, lo nodaiti lehem, I have never shown them before and I never let them know. That's why when Paroi turns around, like when we were kids, and we were all told the story that Moshe goes to Pharaoh and he says, God says, let my people go. And he says, which God? Bring me the dictionary of gods. I don't see his name in here. You ever get told that as a child? You know, you had looked through the catalog of gods and you didn't find Hashem in the catalog. What does that mean? What was Pharaoh unaware of the fact that the Hebrews have their own God? That's different to his God? Did he really not know that? Do we think he was do we honestly think Pharaoh was an idiot? You know, he just sat there on the throne and I don't know, maybe it's because of our familiarity with governments. I don't know, but do we think he was some kind of No, he was a very smart man. He knew things. They were the leading society of the time. Till today, we don't understand half the things the Egyptians did. They were brilliant people. When he says, I don't know Hashem, he's saying, I know the Hebrews have a God, but this Yud Kei Vav Kei, this miraculous God that you're trying to introduce, who's going to interfere with affairs of state in a miraculous fashion, never heard of him. It's never happened before. There's a God who makes it rain. That's natural. There's a God who makes, people have children, God of fertility, a God of bounty, a God, whatever, But there's no God of interfering in the heads of state and changing. That doesn't exist. So what did Abraham have?
He had a child, he had the fire.
Okay, so Abraham had a whole series of personal miracles. But never to interfere in a big country, a superpower of the time, and say, we're going to bring you down using divine power. That had never happened before. So he said, I don't know what this Yud Kei Vav Kei is that you're talking about, and that's relevant because the degree of Hashem's involvement in the world shifts once there's a Jewish people. Prior to this, there's no Jewish people. The Navi Yecheskel tells us there's no Jewish people till now. There's a family of Israelites, B'nai Yisrael, literally. They have a family connection. Now there's going to be an Am Yisrael. It's a whole different business. And they're going to be given a Torah, which means there's going to be a fundamental shift in how everything in the world moves and behaves. And the introduction to that is right here. How do I know the introduction to that is right here? Because Hashem said that to Moshe at the burning bush. He said the objective of leaving Egypt is what? The objective is to reach this mountain so that you can serve Hashem. In other words, the objective of leaving Egypt is to get the Torah because that will define the future. So whatever's happening now is laying the groundwork for the Torah, which is going to fundamentally change the world, and that's what a nes is. A nes is not some kind of an upsetting of the existing system and then leaves everybody in its wake. A nes is intended to make a major change in the world.
So personal nes is different to a grandiose?
Well, let's rather say a nes prior to the giving of the Torah or Am Yisrael is different to a nes after this period in history. So prior, you could say they were personal nisim and they had never seen these big major public nisim. It's not because there's now a difference between personal and public miracles, but rather there's a shift in the entire world structure that's happening right now. So in order to understand this principle, let's say this. There's a miracle called the splitting of the sea. If you saw it, if you were standing on the side watching the splitting of the sea, would you have any question that it's a miracle? Obviously not. You'd think maybe somebody put something in your coffee in the morning. You know what I mean? You couldn't deny that this was absolutely supernatural.
Well, some people think it was the wind.
Well, it was. The Torah says it was the wind.
Yes,
But it's never happened ever again.
It was described as a tsunami.
I don't think it's possible for it to have been a tsunami in that region, but I don't want to go into the unpacking. I don't want to get Yeah, okay, so again, I don't want to get caught up in that side of detail. I want to focus on this point, which is normally when something that spectacular happens, everybody is shaken up at the time. The people who saw it obviously can't unsee it, and nobody else usually believes them. That's usually how it works. There is no guarantee that the people who saw it change as people just because they saw it. You know, I'll tell the story very generically because I don't want to expose anybody, but I once had an interaction with an individual who had a major medical miracle happen literally in front of us. Literally. They went from a Thursday being told that their best prognosis was a major amputation, and maybe that wouldn't be the end of the story. You know, maybe they wouldn't be able to save the person. That was on Thursday. And on Monday, they were told that the tests showed actually that there was no longer any threat at all. There'd be no treatment. So that following Shabbos, I said to the person, why don't you share what happened? And they said, what's there to share? The doctors made a mistake the first time. That can happen. That is common. Just seeing a miracle does not transform a person. So what is the objective of a miracle? To give a platform that raises us. Whether we rise or not, that's a choice. So now you get two kinds of miracles. You get the kind of miracle that completely shatters the natural order. The sea splits. Nobody can deny that that is a miraculous thing that is happening. Or you get the kind of miracle that fuses the miraculous reality with the natural reality. And basically that means that you don't notice the miracle. Or as the Gemara calls it, Ein balanes makir ben isoy. The person the miracle has happened to does not recognize that a miracle has happened to them. Which is like Purim. That's a classic example. The value of that kind of a miracle is it shows the oneness of Hashem. If I see that the natural order doesn't work in the situation, so Hashem has to override it with a miraculous system, then I feel like there's a conflict, so to speak, between the two ways that Hashem runs the world. But when He embeds the miracle in the natural order, there's no longer that conflict. So that's the ultimate miracle. That's where we want to get to. That's not where we are here. We're at the beginning of the process here. Yet still at the beginning of the process, we'll have a taste of that kind of reality. The reality where paradox happens. So in other words, it's a natural situation when Esther's the queen and Mordechai saved the king's life and Haman is already a suspect because he knocked off Vashti and because he's lurking in the palace in the middle of the night. So there's a whole lot of natural explanations, but it's still a miracle anyway. That's a paradox. It's a paradox of the miraculous and the natural happening together. Here, the Tana of the Mishnah wants us to know that there's a massive paradox happening in Egypt. What's the paradox? There is a plague that affects the Egyptians, and at the same time is a miracle for the Jews. Remember, Avram's angels couldn't do that. Remember, you had to have one angel to destroy Sodom and a different angel to either heal Avraham or save Lot. Because the natural way, even in the spiritual realms, is you can't have two opposing energies working together. Look what's happening here in Egypt. What's happening in Egypt is the water turns to blood. But when a Jewish person scoops out a cup of that same blood, I thought somebody was going to say this earlier, that same blood now turns back to water. That means the same force that is creating the miracle of destruction for the Egyptians is simultaneously a force that is creating positive or miracle for the Jews.
If you weren't Jewish or Egyptian, what happened to the water?
So the Torah is quite clear about it, that all the slaves and whoever who belonged to the Egyptians were caught up in their punishment, so to speak, so that none of them would be able to claim, well, my God protected me. Okay? So
I also want to say the Hanukkah story was similar though.
Hanukkah we'll leave for another time because Hanukkah is a little bit more overt.
It's also a bit of a paradox.
It is a paradox. It is definitely a paradox. Okay? So it's kind of somewhere in between Purim and Pesach, right? So you can go through that's why we have all these midrashim that tell us these fascinating stories about how things happened with each of the plagues. It's not to try and make it nice storytelling for Pesach night. It's illustrating to us that the same force that creates havoc for the Egyptians is simultaneously causing miracle for the Jews. Like the same water that splits is the same water that cascades down as blocks of whatever to kill the Egyptians. It's the same theme. Why? Because to destroy Egypt, which is such a powerful, because Hashem created it to be powerful, such a powerful entity, requires nace. Requires Hashem elevating what kind of things he'll put into his world. So you can almost say like this, like Hashem runs the world, so to speak, using this particular level. And now in order to do these miracles, he's now using this level. That's what the Tana is telling us over here. And that's why the Tana tells us first all the good things that happened to the Jews and then all the bad things that happened to the Egyptians, because the message over here is not just that Hashem slapped them on the wrist and saved us. The message is that Hashem totally shifted the world. How did he shift the world? First, he built up our opportunity to emerge on the other side, an elevated nation. That's the goal. Then there's the technical process of how he did it, which is smiting the Egyptians. I love the word smiting when you talk about plagues, because it sounds so biblical, right? We don't use smiting anywhere else. Nobody gets smote by load shedding, you know. We don't use that word anywhere else. So, yeah, exactly. So, right? You see where I'm going with this? First, we've got to create the objective. The objective is nissim for the Jewish people, elevation for the Jewish people. How will we get there? Smash down the Egyptians. The only way to smash down the Egyptians, who are such a powerful force in the world, not just a physical force, but a force of the occult as well. The only way to smash them down is to bring into the story an elevated type of godly energy. How do I know it's there? Because look, the same force that's doing destruction is doing miracle at the same time. So why are the Jews behaving so badly straight afterwards? Sorry.
They forgot. They forgot.
The definition of a miracle is that it's beyond the natural order. Then the plagues in themselves are miracles.
That's right. Yes. So if the definition of a miracle is beyond the natural order, then the plagues are miraculous. What takes them to a whole different level of miraculous is that they are destructive and beneficial simultaneously. That's a contradiction. It makes sense that there should be a supernatural experience that destroys the Egyptians. But then to say it at the same time that it's destroying the Egyptians is consolidating. I think the best example of this is the plague of darkness, right? So the same plague that is freezing the Egyptians literally in their spot is the same one that's illuminating where the Jews have to go in order to find all the wealth that they'll take out of Egypt when they leave in a couple of days' time. So that's a higher level of miracle, a miracle that can accommodate that type of contradiction.
But it's also miraculous in terms of that Hashem is helping the good versus evil. Often in life, we always wonder why the good things happen to bad people.
Well, you could say that the natural order is where good things happen to bad people, and the miraculous order is where things turn around, until, of course, Mashiach comes, when we reveal the true nature and realize that the true nature is that actually good people should be the ones who have good things.
Yeah. Because that's what happened. He did interfere.
He did interfere, absolutely.
Can we just backtrack 1 second? I'm trying to put this together. There's miracles in the world that only come at this point to elevate the Jews or to change reality.
At this point, yes. At this point.
So now Hashem brings them in, so we have to elevate the Jews while we put down the Egyptians in order to create that reality.
So I'm going to say it slightly differently, but effectively what you're saying, just slightly differently. So what's about to happen is the Jewish nation are going to be elevated. Remember, the word nace means to elevate. The Jewish nation are going to be elevated over all the other nations of the world. We know that. It will be told to them just before they get the Torah at Har Sinai, you're going to be a treasured nation. That's what's about to happen. They're about to be elevated beyond everyone and everything else that exists. In order to get there, Hashem has to bring in an elevated type of godly energy into the world that's never been present ever before. And where do we see that elevated energy entering the world? Because we're seeing the kind of miracle we've never seen before. What's a miracle we've never seen before? A miracle that simultaneously creates devastation and salvation simultaneously. Usually they're separate energies. That tells me we're talking now at a higher level of operation where you can accommodate paradox. Just like in a person, right? A less mature person can't tolerate paradox, and a more mature person can. So that's effectively what's happening. What's the goal and the objective? The goal is that we as people come out on the other side elevated. But you look at the end of the Mishnah, it doesn't seem to work, because we come out on the other side challenging Hashem again and again and again. And that is exactly why the Tana puts the two of them together. It might be the most profound personal lesson we take out of this today. Because you know what happens. Tell me if you've ever heard a mother, not you, obviously saying this to her children. I can't believe this is how you act after what I did for you today. Right? Because our expectation is that when we're good to people, we're going to get good in response. The reality is not that way. The reality is when we're good to people, they have to work over time through trial and error until eventually they're mature enough to appreciate that we were good to them.
Yeah.
So if we rate the success of our parenting or the impact that we have on our children based on how within 3 hours of having spoiled them on a Sunday morning they behave, we will not get a good reading on where our kids really are. But if we were to look back, I know it sounds crazy, 30 years later and see how they rated us as parents, that will be far more accurate and insightful. And along the way, there will be major hiccups. Because as Shlomo HaMelech says in Mishlei, Ki sheva yipol tzadik v'kom. The only way that a person rises to become a tzaddik is only by first falling 7 times, multiple times. Doesn't mean 7 necessarily, it means multiple times. What's the message? The fact that the Jews test Hashem shows you that they're working through it. That they're not zombies who just say, oh, we had a miracle, great, we're now part of this cult. We'll just follow along wherever Hashem says. That would not have been a positive outcome. A positive outcome is they work through each chapter of the story and say, okay, we're having a crisis of faith now. A crisis of faith doesn't mean you become an atheist. It doesn't mean that you throw up your whole religion. It means you're going through a crisis. And anybody who's been through a real meaningful crisis of either relationship or faith knows that on the other side you come out stronger. That's what the Tana wants us to know. That despite all the great miracles, we shouldn't imagine that it's a quick fix just like that, because then we wouldn't have been elevated. Hashem would have just been impressive. The goal is not to be blown away by Hashem's greatness. The goal is to use that as a tool to launch our own personal work, which will have its disappointments, but will eventually get us to be an elevated nation. And that's an incredibly powerful message as people, as parents, and as a Jewish nation. So I think everybody will agree we've had enough downfalls along the way. We've been yotzei. I'm sure everybody can agree that we're now ready for the big nace, and we should be elevated, please God, with Mashiach now.